Can you imagine losing everything with a single stroke of a pen, advised by the one person you trusted most? That's exactly where Elias Thorne found himself, perched precariously on the edge of an empire he'd spent decades building. His latest masterpiece, the Meridian, a multi-billion-dollar coastal development along the rugged Atlantic seaboard of Nova Scotia, was supposed to be his magnum opus. It was more than just a project. It was a testament to his ambition, a legacy etched into the very horizon. But then, the horizon blurred. A sudden, unexpected environmental injunction slammed into Thorne Global like a rogue wave, threatening to swallow not just the project, but Elias's entire reputation and freeze his colossal assets. The legal battles ahead loomed like an insurmountable mountain range, each peak a new challenge to his iron will. This wasn't just a delay, it was a public humiliation, a chink in the armor of a man who rarely knew defeat. The silence in his opulent penthouse, overlooking the shimmering lights of Toronto, was deafening, a stark contrast to the usual hum of his bustling empire. It was in this suffocating quiet that Julianne, his wife of 10 years, offered a lifeline that would ultimately become an anchor. Julianne, always the elegant counterpoint to Elias's raw power, moved with the quiet grace of a predator. While Elias was a blunt instrument, cutting through obstacles with sheer force, Julianne was the scalpel, precise and surgical. As the amber glow of a vintage Bordeaux swirled in their glasses, a dangerous idea began to form between them. The Horizon Trust, she purred, her voice a soothing balm against the storm brewing in Elias's mind. She proposed a solution so seemingly elegant, so deceptively simple, that it bypassed all the obvious pitfalls. Transfer the land titles, she explained, to a blind trust managed by her estranged brother, Marcus. Marcus, a man Elias barely knew, was a phantom in their lives, always just out of reach. But Julianne insisted Marcus held a unique maritime loophole through his obscure shipping firm, a legal nuance that would render the environmental injunction utterly powerless. It was a brilliant move, a stroke of genius that could save everything. Elias felt a flicker of hope, a desperate grasp at a solution in the face of impending ruin. "It's a temporary shell, Elias," Julianne whispered, her hand gently tracing the rim of his wineglass, her eyes locked onto his, a promise of salvation in their depths. "Once the foundation is poured, once the legal dust settles, the land reverts to you. It's simply a maneuver, a way to navigate this tempest. You've always told me to play the game 3 moves ahead. This isn't just 3, this is move 4. Her conviction was unwavering, her logic unassailable. Elias, a man who prided himself on his strategic prowess, found himself captivated by the elegance of her scheme. He respected her mind, admired her ability to see angles he might overlook. His legal team, a formidable cohort of the sharpest minds in North America, protested vehemently, their arguments falling on deaf ears. They saw risks, saw red flags, but Elias, blinded by the promise of salvation and his unwavering trust in the woman he loved, dismissed their warnings. He trusted Julianne. She had been his confidant, his partner, his rock for a decade. With a sigh that carried the weight of his empire, he signed the papers, unknowingly signing away more than just land. The regret, when it came, wasn't a gentle stream, it was a ferocious tsunami. It hit him with the force of 1,000 crashing waves, 48 hours after the ink dried on those deceptive documents. Elias, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, drove to the Nova Scotia construction site, the salty tang of the sea air promising a fresh start. But what he found wasn't a fresh start. It was a graveyard of his ambitions. The gates were chained, an ominous, heavy sentinel barring his way. The vibrant Thorne Global signage had been ripped down, replaced by something new, something chillingly familiar. Vanguard Holdings. His blood ran cold. Vanguard Holdings, the firm owned by Arthur Vance, Elias's most reviled, most cutthroat rival. A man he'd fought tooth and nail against for years. A man whose ambition mirrored his own, but whose ethics were decidedly darker. A man who now owned his dream. Elias felt a primal scream rising in his throat, choked by disbelief and a sickening sense of dread. He sprinted back to his downtown Halifax office, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and burgeoning rage, clinging to the last shred of hope that this was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke. But there were no jokes to be found. The Horizon Trust had vanished as if it were a phantom. Marcus, Julianne's phantom brother, had dissolved into thin air, leaving no trace. Elias's frantic calls went unanswered, his emails bounced back. And then, the sickening truth unspooled itself. Buried deep within the reams of fine print in the documents Julianne had so carefully provided was a predatory liquidation clause. A clause designed not to protect, but to devour. The land, his magnificent meridian, had been sold to Vanguard Holdings for a paltry fraction of its true value, all to settle a staged debt. A staged debt. The words echoed in his mind, mocking him, twisting the knife deeper. He had been played, not just by an enemy, but by someone far closer. Elias returned to his opulent Toronto penthouse, the city lights below him mocking his ruined empire, his mind a fevered dream of incandescent rage. He found Julianne in their manicured rooftop garden, a sanctuary that now felt like a cage. She was calmly, meticulously pruning a crimson rose, its thorns a stark metaphor for her deception. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, but Elias couldn't hold back. "The land is gone," he rasped, the words tearing from his throat, raw and broken. Julianne didn't even flinch. She continued to snip, a small smile playing on her lips. Her eyes, when they finally met his, were devoid of remorse, devoid of any genuine emotion. "I know," she replied, her voice cool, detached, as if discussing the weather. "But the stress was killing you, Elias. I did you a favor." A favor. The word resonated with the chilling finality of a death knell. He had not just lost his property, he had lost his trust, his world, and perhaps a part of himself he could never retrieve. What kind of favor was this? The silence in the penthouse was no longer peaceful, it was a pressurized chamber. Elias sat in his mahogany-paneled study, the smell of Julianne's expensive perfume still lingering in the air like a taunt. He realized then that Julianne hadn't just handed over a deed, she had handed over his life's work to the one man who wanted to see him in the dirt. But Elias Thorne didn't become a billionaire by folding when the cards got hot. While Julianne likely expected a divorce filing or a public meltdown, Elias chose a different path. Total, chilling stillness. He began to wonder, if the land was the opening move, what was the endgame? He looked at the reflection of his own haggard face in the window and saw a man who had been a lion but was now being hunted by the very person he had protected. The favor Julianne mentioned was a psychological barb meant to make him question his own sanity. She wanted him broken, perhaps even institutionalized by the grief of his loss, so she could assume total control. Elias began to play the role of the shattered husband, moving through the halls of their estate like a ghost. He stopped going to the office, stopped taking calls from his board of directors, and allowed a layer of dust to settle on his desk. He watched from the corners of his eyes as Julianne's posture changed. She grew taller, more confident, her steps echoing with the rhythm of a victor. She believed the lion was dead. But beneath the floorboards of their shared life, Elias was digging. He didn't call the police because he knew the paperwork she'd made him sign was legally bulletproof in the eyes of a standard court. Instead, he turned his home into a digital web. Under the guise of hiring a grief counselor, who was actually a high-level cybersecurity operative, Elias installed state-of-the-art spyware into the penthouse's internal server. Keyloggers, hidden microphones in the rose garden, and mirrors that were actually lenses. He sat in the dark at 3 a.m., heart hammering against his ribs, watching the first fragments of the truth flicker across his encrypted laptop. The digital trail was more sickening than the financial one. Julianne hadn't been speaking to her brother Marcus at all. Marcus was merely a name on a page, a ghost used to facilitate the transfer. The encrypted messages on her phone led to a burner account. The location pings didn't go to corporate offices or legal firms. They led to a seaside motel on the outskirts of the city, a place far too low rent for a woman of Julianne's tastes. Elias watched a GPS playback of her car parked there for 4 hours every Tuesday for the last 6 months. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It was carnal. He zoomed in on the metadata of a photo she'd received. It was a picture of the Meridian site taken from the window of a helicopter. The shadow of the person holding the camera was unmistakable, the broad shoulders and the custom-made fedora of Arthur Vance. Julianne wasn't just helping her husband. She was clearing the path for her lover to take his crown. They were laughing at him. As Elias watched the data stream in, he felt the last remnants of his love for Julianne burn away, replaced by a cold, calculating vacuum. He wasn't just going to get his land back. He was going to make the Meridian the site of their shared funeral. Elias closed the laptop and walked into the bedroom, where Julianne lay sleeping with the serene breath of a woman who thought she'd won. He stood over her for a long moment, the darkness of the room swallowing his figure. He could have woken her then, could have screamed, could have demanded answers. Instead, he reached down and gently tucked the silk sheet around her shoulders. "Rest well, Julianne," he whispered into the dark. "The game has only just begun." He realized that to beat a scalpel, he couldn't be a blunt instrument anymore. He had to become a ghost. The following weeks were a masterclass in deception. Elias Thorne, once the loudest voice in any room, became a man of whispers and shadows. He started attending therapy sessions in the city, but instead of a couch, he sat in the back of unmarked vans with private investigators. He needed to know every inch of Arthur Vance's debt structure. He learned that Vance had overextended himself to buy the Meridian. To Vance, this wasn't just a trophy. It was a gamble that had to pay off immediately. If the development stalled for even 6 months, Vance's entire empire would begin to crumble under the weight of high-interest loans. Elias smiled for the first time in weeks. His rival had walked into a trap, thinking he was the one setting it. Meanwhile, at home, the psychological chess match intensified. Elias began leaving clues for Julianne to find, forged bank statements showing his offshore accounts were draining due to the injunction, and fake legal notes suggesting he was considering a total surrender. He wanted her to feel overconfident. He watched her through the hidden cameras as she read these documents, her face lighting up with a predatory glee. She would then immediately call Vance, reporting that Elias was crumbling. Each call was recorded. Each betrayal was logged. Elias decided it was time to move the pieces. He reached out to an old contact in the Department of Mineral Resources. He needed a very specific set of documents from the 1920s, records of the original land grants for the Meridian coastal area. While Julianne and Vance had focused on the surface titles and the maritime loopholes, they had ignored the subterranean history of the land. Elias spent hours in a dusty archive, his fingers stained with the ink of century-old maps. He found exactly what he was looking for, a severed estate, clause that had been buried through 5 generations of owners. To keep Julianne from suspecting his renewed energy, he staged a breakdown in the garden. He threw a glass of wine against the wall and sat on the stone bench, head in his hands, knowing she was watching from the terrace. She came down to comfort him, her hand cold on his neck. "It's just money, Elias," she said softly. "We still have each other." Elias looked up at her, his eyes brimming with fake tears, and saw the utter contempt she held for him. In that moment, he realized she didn't just want his money. She wanted to destroy the very idea of him. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Elias confirmed that Arthur Vance had officially moved the Meridian titles into his primary holding company. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Vance had consolidated his assets, making them easier to manage and easier to kill. Elias contacted his chef and instructed him to prepare a menu for a very special occasion, a reconciliation dinner. He told Julianne he wanted to invite Arthur Vance over to end the feud and move on with his life. Julianne's eyes danced with excitement. She thought she was about to witness Elias's final surrender. The night before the dinner, Elias sat alone in the Meridian shadow, parked on a cliff overlooking the construction site. He watched the lights of the security teams Vance had hired. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who trusted his wife and his legacy. That man was gone. In his place was someone much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose but the satisfaction of the hunt. He took a deep breath of the salt air, feeling the weight of the original deed in his pocket. Tomorrow, the Horizon Trust wouldn't be the only thing dissolving. The penthouse was staged with the precision of a crime scene. Elias had spent the afternoon ensuring every candle was flicked to the perfect height and every bottle of wine was decanted to its peak. Julianne floated through the rooms in a gown of shimmering silver, looking every bit the victorious queen. She believed tonight was the funeral for Elias's pride. When the doorbell rang, she didn't just walk to the door. She glided, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of having her lover and her husband in the same room, one broken and one triumphant. Arthur Vance entered the foyer with the swagger of a man who had already moved into the house. He shook Elias's hand with a grip that was just a second too long, a physical assertion of dominance. "Elias, thank you for the olive branch," Vance said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as synthetic. Elias smiled back, a hollow, haunting expression that reached his eyes but carried no warmth. "Business is business, Arthur. Life is too short for old grudges." The lie tasted like copper in his mouth, but he swallowed it whole. As they moved to the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Julian sat between them, acting as the charming mediator, though her glances toward Vance were heavy with a shared secret. Elias watched her play the role of the devoted wife one last time. He realized then that she didn't just want the money, she enjoyed the theater of the betrayal. She relished the feeling of being the smartest person in the room. Elias let her have that feeling. He let it bloom until it was ripe for the picking. The meal was served in courses, each more extravagant than the last. Between bites of Wagyu beef, Vance began to talk about his plans for the Meridian. He spoke of luxury spas and exclusive penthouses, stripping Elias's vision apart and rebuilding it in his own gaudy image. "It's a gold mine, Elias. Truly. I have to thank you for laying the groundwork," Vance chuckled. Julianne raised her glass in a silent toast to her lover. Elias merely nodded, sipping his wine, waiting for the clock on the mantel to strike the hour. "You know, Arthur," Elias said, his voice cutting through Vance's monologue like a blade through silk, "there's a funny thing about coastal land in this part of North America. The history is layered." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. The weight of it seemed to pull the air out of the room. Julianne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She recognized the look in Elias's eyes. It wasn't the look of a broken man. It was the look of a man who had just closed the cage door. "I've spent the last week studying the original 19th century land grants," Elias continued, leaning forward. He slid a document across the table toward Vance. "You bought the surface, Arthur. You bought the view. But you didn't check the subsurface easements or the mineral rights. Those weren't part of the Horizon Trust transfer because I moved them into a separate heritage subsidiary 5 years ago." The room went ice cold. Vance reached for the paper, his hands suddenly trembling. The silence in the dining room was so heavy it felt physical. Arthur Vance's face drained of color as the realization began to sink in. He wasn't just looking at a historical curiosity. He was looking at a financial death warrant. Julianne looked between the two men, her poise finally cracking. "Elias, what are you talking about?" "It's just dirt," she hissed. Elias turned to her, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "It's not just dirt, Julianne. It's the infrastructure corridor. Every pipe, every electrical line, every piling for the foundation has to pass through my estate." Elias turned back to Vance. "In this state, subsurface rights are absolute. To build your hotel, you need to penetrate my property. And I'm not giving you permission." Vance slammed his fist on the table, the crystal rattling. "I'll sue you. This is obstruction." Elias didn't blink. "You can try, but by the time it clears the courts, your high-interest loans will have defaulted. You're leveraged to the hilt, Arthur. I've seen your debt schedule. You need to finish that hotel in 6 months, or Vanguard Holdings collapses." The favor Julianne had done for Elias had now turned into a noose for Vance. To settle the staged debt, Vance had transferred a huge portion of his own liquid capital into the project. He was now tied to a piece of land he couldn't actually build on. Elias pulled out a second document. I'm prepared to offer a solution. I'll grant you the easements. But the tax for using my subsurface property will be 90% of your gross revenue for the next 99 years. Julianne realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had hitched her wagon to a man who was now hurtling toward a cliff. She looked at Vance, expecting him to fight back, to find a loophole, but all she saw was a man realizing he'd been outplayed by a master. The move 4 she had whispered about was actually Elias's move 5. He had let them steal the land just to lure them into a position where he could bankrupt them both simultaneously. You set us up, Julianne whispered, her voice trembling. Elias looked at her, and for a moment, the mask of the Titan slipped, revealing a deep, aching sadness. No, Julianne. I trusted you. You set yourself up the moment you thought my love for you made me weak. He stood up, the dinner finished. The wagyu was cold, and the wine tasted like ash. He had won, but the victory felt like a hollow shell. He had his empire back, but his home was a graveyard. The fallout was swifter than any environmental injunction. Within 48 hours, Arthur Vance's creditors began to circle like sharks. The news of the subsurface rights conflict leaked to the press, thanks to a well-placed tip from Elias, and Vanguard Holdings stock plummeted. Vance vanished into a cloud of litigation and bankruptcy hearings. He was no longer a rival, he was a cautionary tale. But for Elias, the real battle was the one taking place within the quiet, hollow walls of his penthouse. Julianne didn't leave. She couldn't. With the loss of the Meridian and her involvement in the fraudulent trust, her own assets were frozen or tied up in the coming storm. She moved through the house like a ghost, sleeping in the guest wing, her elegant dresses now looking like shrouds. Elias watched her on the security monitors he had never removed. He saw her sitting in the garden, staring at the roses she had pruned while telling him she was doing him a favor. The silence between them was louder than any shouting match. One evening, Elias found her in the library, a glass of the same vintage Bordeaux in her hand. She didn't look up when he entered. "Why didn't you just call the police?" she asked, her voice a thin reed. Elias looked at the rows of books, at the life they had built on a foundation of lies. "Because the police would have taken you away," he said quietly. "I wanted you to stay here. I wanted you to see what you destroyed every single day." He realized his true regret wasn't the land or the money. It was the advice. He had listened to the person he loved most, and in doing so, he had invited the devil to his table. He had won the property back. The Meridian was proceeding under his sole control again, and his wealth had doubled as he absorbed Vance's distressed assets. He was the most powerful man in the city, and he was utterly, profoundly alone. He looked at Julianne and saw not a wife, but a stranger who had worn his wife's face for a decade. The story of Elias Thorne became a legend in the business world, a tale of a man who owned the earth itself. But the ending was one no one saw coming. Elias didn't throw a victory party. He didn't marry a younger woman. He simply lived in his massive estate with the woman who tried to ruin him. They were two statues in a museum of a dead marriage. He had regained his horizon, but he had lost the ability to ever trust the person standing next to him. He had won the game, but he had lost the world. Narration, voiceover ready, they say the best revenge is living well, but Elias Thorne learned that the most brutal revenge is living with the truth. He got his land back. He broke his rival. He proved he was the smartest man in any room. But every time he looks at the horizon he fought so hard to save, he sees the shadow of a woman who whispered lies into his ear while she held his hand. He followed her advice once, and it cost him his soul. Now, he owns the ground beneath his feet, but he has nowhere left to go. Because when you realize the person you loved was your greatest enemy, you don't just lose a property. You lose the ability to believe in anything at all. He won the war, but as he sits in the silence of his empire, Elias Thorne finally understands the cost of move 4. It's the move that leaves you perfectly, hauntingly alone.